Welcome to Inside the Issues. I'm Renee Eng in for Amrit Singh. We begin with the evolving tariff policies of the Trump administration and reaction from the markets and U.S. trading partners. Now, on Sunday night, President Donald Trump said reciprocal tariffs will take effect April 2nd, which is 2 weeks from Wednesday. The White House says those fees will be imposed on countries that have their own levies on American goods. And President Trump also mentioned other additional tariffs could impact certain sectors.
It's a liberation day for our country because we're going to be getting back a lot of the wealth that we so foolishly gave up to other countries. It's going to be reciprocal. In other words, whatever they're charging, we're charging. Very simple. If they're charging us, we're charging them. Then in addition to that, on autos, on steel, on aluminum, we're going to have some additional tariffs.
Now, the White House previously announced 25% tariffs on imports from Mexico and Canada. Now, those fees are on a month-long pause, and one exception would be Canadian energy products. President Trump has said those tariffs would be 10%. And imports from China are subject to an additional 10% fee on top of an existing 10% tariff that went into effect last month. It's a lot to keep track of. And joining me now with more on what those tariffs could mean for us here in Southern California is the CEO and director of the Port of Los Angeles, Seroka. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Great to be here in the studio, Renee.
All right, let's start off with the Port of LA, right? Let's start kind of big picture in terms of what these tariffs could mean. How could that impact the volume, for example? And what have you already seen? Yeah,
there's a lot that goes into this, as you said. We've seen about 7 consecutive months of peak season volume. Importers front-loading this inventory to get it in before these price hikes take place. We're also seeing the small to middle-sized companies here that import struggling to do just that. They may not have the capability of bringing in additional inventory, warehousing it, holding it until they want to go to market. Now what we start to see is probably in the second half of the year a drop-off in freight volume simply because we've got so much inventory now in the country.
Now, in terms of that stockpiling, can you talk a little bit more about that? Is that something that you've seen in previous times where there, for example, is some economic uncertainty where you see businesses importing a lot of that, stockpiling it, just see what happens?
Yeah, we have a little experience in this area from the first Trump administration. In 2018, when the tariffs went in place, March of that year, we saw big run-ups to those tariff implementation dates, drop-offs afterwards. So much so that by the end of 2019, our business was down 16% in the fourth quarter alone.
And then let's also talk about, of course, port operations, right? If you have a drop-off that I imagine will impact jobs, operations at the port itself, what do you anticipate there?
Yeah, every 4 containers we move creates a job. This is absolutely business mission critical for us. Realistically speaking, there are about 1 million jobs here in Southern California that rely on the port's activities every day, and about 2.7 million nationwide. Fewer containers mean less jobs.
And then you'd also mentioned, for example, businesses, they're stockpiling inventory. How else are you seeing them trying to deal with all of this economic uncertainty right now? Maybe evaluating their operations? Is it going to impact their staff?
Yeah, I think so. We just had a big conference in Long Beach, California, the Trans-Pacific Maritime Conference. And talking to CEOs, business leaders, members of the C-suite, it's confusion that's centered around this conversation. Tariffs on again, off again, what do I do? Now the discussion is around China-built ships calling U.S. ports and fines being levied against those companies for every single port call. So we've got tariffs, fines on ships based on country of manufacture. All this will lead to passing these charges down to the consumer level. Prices are going to go up.
And then for these businesses that, maybe watching this interview or watching kind of all this on again, off again, tariff activity, if you will, what would you suggest they do? Do you think maybe a wait and see approach is better, or kind of do they need to really evaluate their operations now and start to take some action?
Yeah, I think most of the discussions we've had are around engagement. How do we get in front of the decision makers? How do we talk from industry perspectives, whether you're a retailer, automotive manufacturer, shipping line, and make sure that the impacts of some of these decisions are made known and clearly. Not going to get into a confrontation, but this is going to have an impact from the American consumer back to companies and how they're hiring, what they look at for those staffing requirements, capital investments, and others in companies and broadly in these supply chains are also questionable.
And then speaking of the American consumer, when do you anticipate that they may feel some impacts of this, maybe some expected price hikes? Because I feel like you're right at the port, you're kind of the first line of defense. You see it early on, but we may not necessarily see that when we go shopping right away.
I think it's going to happen pretty quickly across the board. These tariffs have been wide coverage areas, right? Back in 2018, a little bit narrower, even in the Biden administration, kind of targeted. But I think we start to see prices move pretty quickly.
And you also mentioned earlier that port volume you anticipate will kind of have a downturn. When do you think that'll happen? Kind of in a few months, or is it more quickly than that?
Yeah, our best estimate is the second half of the year. So from our traditional peak season onward, now you'll still have seasonal products coming through, back to school and the year-end holidays. But for the bulk of these shipments that have been advanced now, that's where we'll see the dip in volume. I'm estimating the second half of the year will be about 10% lower than the same time last year.
Okay, and then of course, post-LA fires, right? Canada, for example, biggest supplier of steel and aluminum. How do you think that these tariffs will impact rebuilding? I mean, for thousands of homes, potentially, right?
This couldn't be at a worse time. We need steel and aluminum, softwood lumber from Canada, appliances from Mexico, furniture from China, and all those prices went up as we're trying to aggressively help and rebuild homes for families, businesses across both the Palisades and the Altadena area. We've got to find some relief on the goods that are coming in this area, and that's part of what the discussion needs to be.
I'm curious for you. I imagine you're getting calls, you're fielding calls from people that are really worried. What are you telling people as you're getting these concerns?
This is still a relationship-based business. And from my time, more than a decade spent in Asia, we just welcomed a China delegation last week working on clean vessel fuels. They have a lot of questions about what this is all going to look like. For the supply chain experts today, it's continue to look at your options of sourcing and manufacturing. Make sure you have some consistency in the pricing, and let's stick together and talk about where we can keep this supply chain moving and what opportunities may exist in their China Plus One strategies.
All right, well, this will be an interesting year to see what unfolds for both of us. CEO and Director of the Port of Los Angeles, Seroka.